Welcome to Quest Club for January 7th. Thank you all for braving both the cold and COVID to join us today. I think we're going to have a wonderful and informative presentation. To begin, I'm going to ask Joan Goldner to come deliver our invocation.
In light of what's going on with our world and our country and our city nowadays, I thought that what I would like to share with you is a blessing. And this is written by John O'Donohue, he is was an Irish poet, theologian, and teacher. And this is from his book, To Bless the Space Between Us. And he thinks that a blessing offers warmth and protection and the feeling that we're not alone. And one point in this blessing, there is a word called currach, and in Ireland it's a boat that's made with a wooden frame and stretched over with animal hides and skins, and then later is a canvas. So this is a blessing for the new year. On the day when the weight deadens on your shoulders and you stumble, may the clay dance to balance you. And when your eyes freeze behind the gray window and the ghost of loss gets into you, may a flock of colors, indigo, red, green, and azure blue, come to awaken in you a meadow of a delight. When the canvas frays and the currach of thought and a stain of ocean blackens beneath you, may there come across the waters a path of yellow moonlight to bring you safely home. May the nourishment of the earth be yours. May the clarity of light be yours. May the fluency of the ocean be yours. May the protection of the ancestors be yours. And so may a slow wind work these words of love around you, an invisible cloak to mind your life. In this new year, may we all experience blessings upon blessings, and then offer blessings to all of us to help heal and renew us. Happy New Year.
We'll move on to today's paper, which is being presented by Dr. Peter Hanley. Peter was born and grew up in Jamaica. His father was in the British Army and, as Peter says, stayed in Jamaica after marrying the landlady's daughter. Peter studied physics at the University of the West Indies on a Jamaica scholarship. Thereafter, he spent 2 years at UC San Diego in its PhD program in the Department of Applied Physics and Information Science, where he discovered that he would prefer to be a physician. Peter studied physiology and medicine at Oxford University on a Rhodes Scholarship. Upon completing his schooling, he worked 2 years in the National Health Service in the United Kingdom. Thereafter, he completed internal medicine residency at the Johns Hopkins Hospital and completed cardiovascular diseases fellowships at the Mayo Clinic. Upon completing his fellowship, Dr. Hanley worked for Kaiser Permanente in Sacramento and the Ochsner Clinic in Baton Rouge, prior to joining Bob Swint's cardiology group in Fort Wayne in 1980. He is married to Patty, and they have 3 children and 6 grandchildren. He notes that he is in the process of retiring, having received too much radiation exposure in the cath lab over the years and too much burnout exposure from the medical system. Peter?
Just to let you know, this topic is way outside of my purview here. Topic is the gold standard, and thanks for coming today, all of you who braved COVID. The term the gold standard refers to economic systems where gold is used as the standard for a monetary system. Its history spans 254 years, ending with its demise in 1971. I'll discuss and describe its complex and contentious history and delve into its merits and demerits. I'll describe the use of the precious metals gold and silver and banknotes as money. Politics, laws, and wars have factored prominently in its history and will be noted as appropriate. I'll conclude with remarks regarding possible resuscitation of a gold standard. It's a monetary system, it's economics, and it is history, literally. It's kaput. As you may have heard, economics has an unfortunate and somewhat checkered history. It has been characterized as the dismal science since 1849, when Thomas Carlyle, the Scottish historian and scholar, in an article entitled Occasional Discourse on the Negro Question, argued against the emancipation of West Indian slaves. In this article, Carlyle excoriated contemporary political economic thought, describing economics as a dreary, desolate, and indeed quite abject and distressing science, what we might call the dismal science. Why he chose to publish this article 15 years after the Slavery Abolition Act took effect in Great Britain and its tropical colonies and Canada in 1834 remains unclear to me too. This criticism of economics gets worse, however. Despite its elevation to Nobel Prize status in 1968, some have, perhaps tongue-in-cheek, questioned whether economics might even be considered a science at all. For example, no less a luminary than John Kenneth Galbraith, who was a professor of economics at Harvard for 50 years and authored 33 books, was quoted as saying, "The only function of economic forecasting is to make astrology look respectable." Perhaps not surprisingly, he was not awarded a Nobel Prize. Since today's topic is historical, you might also keep in mind what the noted philosopher George Santayana said. History is a pack of lies about events that never happened, told by people who weren't there. My hope is that I have avoided all historical lies, and despite the dismal science, you will find this talk entertaining. With that said, let's proceed. So what is a gold standard and why gold? The gold standard is a monetary system where the standard unit of currency is a fixed quantity of gold, for example, a standard gold coin, or is kept at the value of a fixed quantity of gold. This does not mean that gold is necessarily directly used for commerce, though it could be. Another metal, for example, silver or paper money, could be used as a representation of gold. There have been several types of gold standard. I'll describe these as we make our way through this on-again, off-again history of gold standards in their various applications. I'll begin with the original gold coin standards in the 1700s and end with the abandonment of the gold parity standard in 1971. Later on in this talk, I will refer to fiat money. The term fiat money refers to all kinds of money made legal tender by government decree or fiat. The term, however, is usually reserved for legal tender coins or paper money that have face values that far exceed their commodity values and are not redeemable in gold or silver. When the words "the gold standard" are used, what usually comes to mind is the monetary system first put into practice in Great Britain in the early to mid-1800s and subsequently adopted by many countries in the late 1800s, which was the gold bullion standard. It included a promise by governments to allow the convertibility, that is, the exchange of its legal tender for gold bullion held in a government gold reserve on demand from its citizens at a price fixed by the government. The need to allow conversion limits the amount of money in circulation to a multiple of the central bank's gold reserves. The system has several merits. It's relatively simple and inspired public confidence in the currency since gold is universally accepted as a source of value. It required no government intervention since the supply of cash was linked to and depended on the volume of gold reserves. It allowed unrestricted import and export of precious metals and provided foreign exchange rate stability, thereby promoting international trade. It disincentivized and restricted a king or government from printing money at will and inflating the money supply, since people would notice their money being devalued and opt to exchange government currency for gold at a fixed convertibility rate, thereby depleting the gold reserves which back the system. It also provided a natural price stability effect by providing some control over mining gold for profit. It also had major demerits. Over time, the system would tend to become unsustainable as trade and economies expanded, and it became challenging to increase the gold reserves that were needed to back the system, and the money supply could therefore become relatively inflexible. It was expensive to maintain, since gold is expensive, and coinage wear and tear naturally occurs during circulation. Also, the adoption of a different monetary policy that might be better suited to prevailing economic stressors, such as war, was constrained, which some have also noted as a potential merit. As with any system, it only worked if the rules were followed. So why gold? The use of gold coins and coins in general as money began approximately 2,000 years ago in China. The use of coins in Eurasia began in approximately 640 BC in Lydia, a kingdom in Anatolia which is now central Turkey, when lumps of gold, silver, and bronze were flattened and stamped with lions' heads and were known as Lydian lions. Subsequently, Greeks, Persians, Macedonians, and later Romans copied these techniques and minted their own different coins. After this, beginning before and extending through the Middle Ages, the history of money is probably best described as a time of coinage chaos. Various empires and many city-states, which were evolving and devolving in the time of frequent wars, minted their own different coins. As the Middle Ages drew to a close in the 14th to 15th centuries, Europe moved towards gold as coinage, with the production of several gold coins, primarily in the Italian city-states and in England. These coins spread to the rest of Europe, and the popularity of gold as money became firmly established. A system of using gold and silver together for coinage, so-called bimetallism, was commonly adopted, with gold used for coins of greater values and silver for those of lesser values. So why was gold preferred? Henry Hazlitt, the American journalist and economist, who authored the popular book Economics in One Lesson, noted, "The great merit of gold is precisely that it is scarce, that its quantity is limited by nature, that it is costly to discover, to mine, and to process, and that it cannot be created by political fiat or caprice." Fiat meaning decree, and caprice meaning sudden impulse. However, the British economist Dennis Holmes Robertson, who collaborated closely with John Maynard Keynes when they both taught at Cambridge, has probably provided the most salient rationale for the use of gold as coinage, when he said, quote, "A yellow metal gold was originally chosen as money because it tickled the fancy of savages." So to simplify and summarize, gold was pretty, it does not tarnish unlike silver, and it was indestructible. So what about paper money? Paper, unlike precious metals, has little intrinsic value, and it is also used for currency. Once again, China, as with coinage, preceded Europe in using paper for money. The Song dynasty in approximately 1100 AD used government-produced paper money with a warning printed on the notes that the punishment for counterfeiting was decapitation. This replaced the need to carry heavy money bags around, and commerce in China was simplified. In 1661, the first European banknotes were issued by Stockholm Banco, the first Swedish bank, which had been established in 1657. Banknotes quickly caught on in Europe because of convenience, as they had in China. However, in the absence of appropriate laws and with the availability of the printing press, which was introduced to Europe in 1436, virtually everyone with access to a printing press began printing their own banknotes. This included states, principalities, cities, guilds, banks, and even private individuals. banknote chaos subsequently ensued in Europe and later spread to the US, with the attendant risks of counterfeiting and inflation. These early banknotes essentially only traded at face value in the market served by the issuing bank, and with time and with the passage of monetary laws were replaced by national banknotes issued by central banks or other monetary authorities. I'll now describe the gold standard in Great Britain, where it all started. Following this, I'll move on to the US. The first attempt at a gold standard for coinage was made by Queen Anne of England, Scotland, and Ireland in 1704. She decreed that her colonies in the British West Indies should only use her gold coins and currency. This was a gold coin standard, also referred to as a gold specie standard. Specie meaning metallic money of any type. Her attempt failed because of Britain's mercantilist policy of hoarding gold and silver from its colonies for use at home. So even though prices in the British West Indies were quoted in gold pounds sterling, the Spanish silver dollar continued to be predominantly used. Mercantilism is an economic theory widely adopted at that time, which is based on the concept that trade generates wealth, which is stimulated by the accumulation of profitable trade balances, which a government should encourage by means of trade protectionism. Following this, in 1717, Sir Isaac Newton, the ultimate alchemist, who was the warden and master of the Royal Mint since 1696, created what has been referred to as a de facto or accidental gold specie standard. He mistakenly set the exchange rate of silver to gold too low, and thereby caused a run on silver coins, whose market value then exceeded their face value. This resulted in the rapid disappearance of silver coins from circulation to be hoarded or melted down, leaving gold coins as the only legal tender available. This phenomenon, not unexpectedly, has occurred relatively frequently since then, affecting both silver and gold coins in bimetallic monetary systems, when the value of a precious metal used in coinage has exceeded the face value of the coin. From about 1750 to 1870, wars in Europe, which were frequent, and a growing Chinese trade deficit gradually drained silver from the economies of Europe and the US, since China exported to these economies but had little use for Western imports. By the 1790s, Great Britain had developed a major silver shortage and ceased minting larger silver coins. Shortly after that, when the Napoleonic Wars ended in 1815, they began a major recoinage program using mainly gold. By the early 1800s, Great Britain was becoming the world's dominant financial, industrial, and commercial power, in large part to becoming the leading force in the Industrial Revolution, but also because of its vast colonial empire, the use of slavery, and the adoption of mercantilism. The Bank of England, founded in 1694 and privately owned until 1946 when it was nationalized, had issued paper banknotes since its founding, as had other banks. In 1821, Great Britain established a gold bullion standard where legal tender, which included coinage, but did not include banknotes at that time, was exchangeable for gold bullion at a fixed price. However, despite this gold bullion standard and a concurrent boom in exports, investments, and the stock market, many bank failures ensued and a stock market crash followed 4 years later. This was primarily fueled by the Bank of England's easy money policy at that time and by an overproduction of coins. Subsequently, Bank of England banknotes were made legal tender in 1833, and other banks were discouraged from printing their own banknotes. The Bank Charter Act of 1844 made Bank of England banknotes fully exchangeable for gold, which marked the establishment of a full gold bullion standard for British money. The history of the US adoption of the gold standard is quite different. Prior to the War of Independence, beginning in 1775 and ending in 1783, the colonies used English, Spanish, French, and Massachusetts coins under English rule. After the war, Thomas Jefferson, Robert Morris, and Alexander Hamilton recommended that the decimal system be adopted and applied to money. and 2 years after the war ended, a silver coin standard based on the Spanish dollar was adopted. Following the Mint Act of 1792, which established the US Mint, a bimetallic system was adopted with the dollar as the principal unit of currency. The first US coins were struck at the newly established Philadelphia Mint 1 year later. Private banks were allowed to print their own paper money under state charters, and approximately 1,600 did. However, the mint ratio was fixed at 15-1 silver to gold, and the market rate fluctuated at various times, between 15.5-1 to 16-1, and so on, resulting in runs on gold and silver at various times, periodic bank failures, and an unstable monetary system. In 1834, the Coinage Act was passed, which decreased the price of silver, which had become overvalued relative to gold in the US. This resulted in the near disappearance of silver from circulation and a de facto gold coin standard in 1834. The dollar value was set at $20.69 per troy ounce of gold. A troy ounce contains 2.75 grams more than a regular ounce. The US then remained on a bimetallic system until the Civil War, and banknotes were not legal tender. So to put this into perspective, by the early 1800s, before the US Civil War, Great Britain had become the dominant global power and had adopted a gold bullion standard. Several other countries had increased their gold reserves with the increasing availability of gold from discoveries in the US from 1797 to the 1850s, and in Australia in the 1850s. These countries, noting the attraction of accessing London's financial markets and stable exchange rates, increasingly adopted the British gold bullion standard system following their own periods of similar monetary instability. In the US, shortly after the start of the Civil War in 1861, the Legal Tender Act was passed, and a fiat monetary system was established with the issuance of fiat paper banknotes called greenbacks, because their backs were printed in green ink. They were produced to help finance the Civil War, and approximately 400 million, equivalent to $12.63 billion today, were issued during the war. These bills were not convertible on demand into specie initially. Also, to help finance the war, tariffs were raised and the first national income tax was passed in 1862. Inflation, which had rapidly occurred in the South, also gradually arose in the North. To deal with the increasing monetary crisis and to provide a solid monetary system, the US was pushed to informally accept the gold bullion standard in 1879 and to formally accept it 11 years later. The Gold Standard Act was then signed into law by President William McKinley in 1900. The act formalized that all forms of money issued by the US government, including government-issued notes and greenbacks, were to be maintained at parity with the gold dollar. This established gold as the sole basis for exchanging coinage and paper money in the US. By the early part of the 20th century, all the world's key economies, except China and some Central American countries, had joined the UK or the US on the gold bullion standard. Germany, after it had extracted reparations from the French following the victory in the Franco-Prussian War in 1871, moved to the gold bullion standard 2 years later, and France followed 5 years after that. Japan, similarly to Germany, had gained the needed gold reserves after the Sino-Japanese War ended in 1895 and adopted a gold bullion standard 2 years later, which allowed it to better access Western markets and global trade. Many countries without adequate gold reserves adopted a gold exchange standard, which was a way that those governments could fix the value of their currencies in terms of gold, regardless of its intrinsic value, and operate within this system. For example, the system was adopted by the province of Canada and Australia and New Zealand in 1854 and by Ceylon in 1901. Many silver standard countries pegged their silver coin values to the gold standard units of Great Britain or the US towards the end of the 1800s, and in the early 1900s, thereby establishing a gold parity standard. For example, British India pegged their silver rupee to the British pound in 1898, and the Philippines pegged their silver peso to the US dollar in 1903. Following this, there was a period of relatively smooth sailing for the gold standard until 1914, when World War I was ignited by the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Germany immediately abandoned the gold standard, and the British Empire abandoned the gold standard shortly after. Many other countries similarly abandoned or suspended the gold standard. In order to finance the war, printing presses fired up all over the world, producing large quantities of unbacked paper money and treasury notes, resulting in severe inflation. Prices doubled in the UK and the US, they tripled in France, and they quadrupled in Italy. The cost of US goods decreased relative to those in Europe, and the dollar value of US exports tripled between August 2014 and the spring of 2015, when the US trade surplus exceeded $1 billion for the first time. I've not seen it written anywhere, but I speculate that perhaps partly because of this, the US stayed out of the war as long as it could. However, President Woodrow Wilson requested and Congress declared war on Germany on April 7, 1917, because the Germans had broken their pledge to suspend unrestricted submarine attacks on shipping in the North Atlantic and the Mediterranean, and also because of its attempts to form an alliance with Mexico against the US, revealed in the Zimmermann telegram of January 1917. The US, despite the war, did not suspend the gold standard during World War I. The Federal Reserve, which had been created in 1913 to establish a national banking system and to address the currency instability of the rapidly growing US economy, especially following the Civil War, was able to intervene. The Fed sold bonds, which served to neutralize some of the gold imports that otherwise would have increased the money supply. After the war, there was an economic boom in the US and the UK, reflected by the term the Roaring Twenties, which lasted till the mid-1920s. In the UK, Winston Churchill, the Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time, introduced the Gold Standard Act of 1925 in an attempt to stabilize the economy. The act discontinued the minting of gold coins and allowed a redemption of currency for 400 ounces, which is 25 pounds, of fine gold bars, and established a hybrid gold standard based on both bullion and foreign exchange, which France also followed. Fine gold is gold which is almost pure, and I'll just leave it at that. It's complicated. Unfortunately, Churchill fixed the dollar to pound ratio at the pre-war rate of $4.85 to 1 pound, which led to UK exports being too expensive, which resulted in falling demand for UK manufacturing, deflation, and prolonged high unemployment, and ultimately to the May 1926 general strike in the UK. In the US, during the Roaring Twenties, rapid economic growth occurred with the appearance of many new products and services, and the US dollar became overvalued and contributed to a boom in the US economy, leading to a market bubble. Stocks were largely purchased on margin and became greatly overvalued. Wages remained low and unemployment grew. Debt proliferated due to the Federal Reserve's easy money policy at the time, and extremely large bank loans could not be liquidated. The US stock market crashed on Black Tuesday, October 24, 1929, initiating the Great Depression, which had devastating worldwide effects, including international trade plunging greater than 50%. By 1931, the Bank of England was about to run out of gold because of a panicked populace trading in their paper money for gold. The UK then abandoned the hybrid gold standard in 1931, an act which was said to have torn asunder any remaining confidence in the banking system. Germany, Austria, and other European countries were similarly affected. The German central bank collapsed, and several other European banks suspended gold convertibility. In the US, Herbert Hoover, who had been elected president 8 months before the stock market crash, was opposed to direct government intervention by the Federal Reserve, which was limited to providing loans up to 40% of its reserves, and was close to that level at that time. And he did nothing. Multiple banking panics had occurred between 1930 and 1933, and approximately 10,000 banks failed. It was approximately half of all US banks. By 1933, 25% of the US workforce was unemployed, and minority unemployment was greater than 50%. There was a growing imbalance of payments, with imports exceeding exports despite large tariffs. The tools available to the Fed to stimulate the economy and meet the public's increased demand for cash were to create more money and lower interest rates. However, creating more paper money was expected to undermine the gold standard and incentivize gold exports, resulting in difficulty maintaining the dollar at its legal gold value. Similarly, lowering interest rates would have increased the export of gold from the US as investors looked abroad for greater returns. This situation came to a head with the inauguration of FDR after his landslide victory over Herbert Hoover. The day after his inauguration on March 4th, 1933, and largely over his advisors' objections, he assembled a special session of Congress to declare an immediate 4-day bank closure, subsequently expanded to 1 week, in effect suspending all bank transactions in order to stop bank runs and gold exportation. This was the so-called Bank Holiday of 1933. By executive order, he took the US off the gold standard, ostensibly to prevent further runs on gold. The hoarding of gold was forbidden, and gold coins and bullion were ordered turned into the government at an official compensation rate of $20.67 per ounce, with the exception of $100 of gold coins, gold bullion, or gold certificates, some jewelry, and collectors' coins. He ordered all gold coin production to cease and all 1933 minted coins destroyed. Obviously, all weren't, but anyway, that's a different story. Failure to comply was punishable by a heavy fine of $10,000, which is equivalent to $213,800 today, and or 10 years in prison. All of these executive actions were endorsed by Congress with the passage of the Emergency Banking Act on March 9th, 1933, which has been characterized as the most draconian event in US financial history. Before this, while still president, Herbert Hoover had formally counseled FDR, noting, "We have gold because we cannot trust governments." On March 12, 1933, FDR, at his first Friends Chat, said, "I can assure you that it is safer to keep your money in a reopened bank than under a mattress." In 1934, the US Gold Reserve Act was passed, which, among other things, banned the export of gold, ordered all Federal Reserve banks to turn over their gold supplies and gold certificates to the US Treasury, prohibited redeeming dollar bills for gold, and allowed the president to set the price of gold. FDR then reset the price of gold from $20.67 to $35, which devalued the dollar by almost 60%, greatly increased the value of gold reserves, stimulated gold exploration, and gold again found its way into the US Treasury. Since then, US citizens have not been able to exchange their dollars or gold certificates for gold. By 1937, no nation was using the international gold standard, and needless to say, it was not in use during World War II. To summarize then, World War I had nearly demolished the international gold standard. In the mid-1920s, some industrial nations, mainly the UK and France, had restored the international gold standard, hoping to stabilize the world economy. The gold standard was largely abandoned during and after the Great Depression, which officially ended in 1939, because of its propensity for volatility and the constraints that it placed on governments by retaining a fixed exchange rate and its limitation of expansionary policies. After the end of World War II in July 1944, In an attempt to reestablish a stable global financial system, 730 delegates from all 44 allied countries met at Bretton Woods in New Hampshire for the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference. The brains behind the conference were Henry White, the US Treasury Secretary, and the famous British economist John Maynard Keynes, who 2 decades earlier had described the gold standard as a barbarous relic. Keynes, the advisor to the British Treasury at the time, was an asthmatic and refused to meet in sweltering Washington, so what better place than the Bretton Woods ski resort? The conference resulted in an agreement to keep the value of currencies stable, that is, less than 1% changed. Countries would define the par value of their money in terms of gold in order to determine an exchange rate, and would buy and sell US dollars to maintain currency stability. The US pledged to back the dollar with gold, and foreigners could exchange dollars for gold at $35 per ounce. Subsequent US presidents worked hard, so it was said, to support the dollar and the Bretton Woods system. However, increasing foreign aid, increasing investment, and military spending created a US dollar surplus. The US did not have enough gold to cover the dollar at $35 per ounce, and by the late 1960s, concurrently a large fiscal deficit developed as the US printed money to fund the Vietnam War and President Johnson's Great Society social programs aimed at ending poverty, reducing crime, abolishing inequality, and improving the environment. In the mid and late 1960s, the gold cover ratio, which is the ratio of the amount of gold to all US currency plus reserves held by the Fed, fell precipitously, and laws were passed in 1965 to reduce, and in 1968 to remove the gold cover requirement. On April 7, 1971, the Joint Economic Subcommittee on International Exchange and Payments reported that the US dollar was overvalued and urged that the dollar be devalued. On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon announced a, quote, new economic policy, which included several domestic policy changes designed to help ensure his re-election. He noted that in order to, quote, protect the dollar from the attacks of international money speculators, close quote, that dollars held by foreign countries would no longer be exchangeable for gold bullion at any price. This was the so-called Nixon shock, which unilaterally and automatically ended the gold parity standard of the Bretton Woods system. Since 1971, the US has had a fiat dollar backed by the, quote, full faith and credit of the US government, and not backed by gold bullion or convertible into gold. The possibility of bringing back the gold standard has been extensively debated over the years since then. It has been said that implementing it again would be a very difficult task in a world with the IMF, the World Bank, modern central banks, and currency wars between countries or groups of countries. Also in the US, there are not enough gold reserves to back all the dollars currently in circulation. I'll now leave you with a few final thoughts. Friedrich A. Hayek, the best-known advocate of the Austrian School of Economics, who did collect his Nobel Prize in 1974, said, with the exception only of the period of the gold standard, practically all governments of history have used their exclusive power to issue money to defraud and plunder the people. Milton Friedman, the intellectual leader of the Chicago School of Economics, who collected his Nobel Prize in 1976, said, a real gold standard is thoroughly consistent with classical liberal principles, and I, for one, am entirely in favor of measures promoting its development. Ben Bernanke, Fed chair from 2006 to 2014, who has not yet been awarded a Nobel Prize, during a lecture in 2012 said, a gold standard would not be feasible for both practical and policy reasons. And last but not least, as you are no doubt aware, ex-President Donald J. Trump has an irresistible attraction to gold, including the gold in Nobel medals. On November 23, 2015, he opined, bringing back the gold standard would be very hard to do, but boy, would it be wonderful. we'd have a standard on which to base our money. So if things go his way, I guess we might see the gold standard in some form resuscitated. Thank you for your attention.